I'm Stuart Bond. I'm Vice President Research at IDC, focused on data integration, data intelligence software, and I'm your track producer for this track. We're going to be hearing from Corey Eastman and Lafir Thassim? Okay, sorry. Our topic title today, Leveraging Data for Change, how UBS harnesses data management capabilities to support transformation. So Corey will be kicking us off. Corey Eastman joined ThoughtWorks in 2019. He's a global executive principal who currently leads large-scale strategic client growth in teams across international markets in North America, LATAM, EMEA, and APAC. He also heads up the global Spotify Backstage partnership, helping organizations deliver better developer effectiveness in order to improve speed to market and growth for digital products. Prior to ThoughtWorks, some of his experience includes working for technology startups acquired by Facebook and Salesforce, and public companies including IBM and Huge. And from UBS, we have Lafir, who's Managing Director and Head of Group Data Management at UBS. Lafir is Managing Director, I just said that. He's responsible for the development and implementation of the firm's data management policies and frameworks across the group, driving sustained transformation across the firm's multiple business divisions and functions from a data management perspective. Lafir holds a double major in finance and accounting as a chartered financial analyst and a certified public accountant. He has over 20 years of experience in the financial services industry, covering data management, balance sheet and revenue control, cash and liquidity management, foreign exchange, and OTC deliverables. We will have time at the end for some Q&A, and I will have a microphone with me that I will come around and get people to use, and we need to use the microphone. If we don't use the microphone, no one will hear on the recording, no one will hear online. With that, I will hand it over to Corey.
Awesome. Thanks, Corey. Appreciate it. All right, hello. How's everyone doing? All right, good first day energy. My name is Corey Eastman, for those just coming in. I'm with ThoughtWorks. We're a global technology consultancy, and I have the privilege of introducing Lafir Thassim. So without going through the bio, again, he is the head of the Group Data Management Office at UBS, where he's responsible for the overall strategy of data management within UBS. Over 20 years of experience at UBS. Prior was at KPMG, and is coming to us from Westchester, New York, where he resides with his family. Likes to spend time ballroom dancing when he's not at UBS, as well as sitting on boards such as Street Law. So if there's any former attorneys or future attorneys, I'm sure you can have a quick chat and strike up some conversation with Lafir. So really excited about this talk. For those not familiar with UBS, they are the largest wealth management firm in the world, been around for over 160 years. Based in Zurich, Switzerland, most recently have merged with Credit Suisse, although we can't talk too much about that today. What you will learn about is how data management can be used for your organization's transformations, as well as 4 key capabilities that you can use to accelerate that. So without further introduction, Lafir.
Thank you, Corey, for that great introduction. You guys can hear me clearly at the back? Yes. I also happen to have 3 kids, so ballroom dancing doesn't take place much of the time. That said, thanks for that. I think opportunities like this Symposium provide a good means of sharing best practice across industries. So I would like to spend a few minutes towards the end of the session with some Q&A, especially in terms of how we apply governance, et cetera, from a transformation standpoint across the various industries as well. I know Corey mentioned a little bit about UBS. I do want to spend a few minutes talking about what we do and how we are structured as an organization, because I think that'll help understand some of the examples we have later on in the session. So since 1862, and that's a year after MIT was founded, it seems, so 160 plus years, we have been providing financial solutions and products to a variety of clientele across the planet. right now we're looking at slightly under 5 trillion in assets under management, and a lot of these are structured across multiple business divisions and group functions that support those business divisions. So, for example, we have an investment bank, which is essentially a mix of businesses from a derivatives perspective, from a fixed income equities, and so on and so forth. We have an asset management arm. We have, of course, a wealth management franchise. And then supporting that, you have a set of business divisions, group functions, group finance, group risk, etc. Each of these business divisions on its own would be a reasonably sized company of itself. Now, this is important because as you look to exercise data governance across the enterprise, those distinctions start to matter. Okay, so before I go into talking about transformation and how data management capabilities enable that, let's specify a little bit what we mean by transformation. The dictionary definition talks a little bit about large-scale change, metamorphosis in the context of animals, right? And you think about organizations, essentially what that represents to me is a move or a change that drives the organization towards achieving a competitive advantage, dealing with a significant challenge that they run into as they go on that journey. And to me, you can apply these capabilities in 4 different contexts. And I'll talk a little bit later on about how we have established capabilities that support transformation from a data management perspective. I'll give you a few examples of how we've applied that, and then happily answer some of your questions on that execution. So you get from these certain tools that you can use as you go back to your jobs later on in the week. Okay, so first, let's talk a little bit about decision making. Okay, this is your traditional data-driven decision-making points. You have capabilities that require, good sound quality data that enable decision-making at all levels of your organization, whether it's from the exec board down to the various operational levels that you have within your organization. Data quality and data quality associated capabilities come to the fore here, and having good contextual data to help drive decisions is useful. Innovation. Here is where you find the ability to surface new insights using the capabilities you have. It is how you use information to surface new markets, products, new products for existing markets, and enhancing your strategies there. Process optimization. This, if you think about from some of your group functions or places where you incur bottlenecks, etc., you get to use this information and these capabilities to drive resolving those bottlenecks, improving efficiency, providing scalability across the enterprise. And then last but not least, as you think about it from a migration standpoint, right? So as you upgrade your application stack, as you move from on-prem to cloud, as you move from application A to application B, you need these data management capabilities to make those moves relatively straightforward and painless, though some would argue there's always a little bit of degree of pain when you move data around the organization. All right. I talked a little bit about data management, right? And that in and of itself is a broad term. So I want to talk a little bit about how we think about data management inside of UBS. And this then aligns with how we structure our data capabilities organizationally and then assign the various roles and responsibilities across the firm. If you think about it from a confidentiality standpoint, this is your information security office, the chief information security officer, and the roles that come associated with that. These are technologists that make sure that data leakages and protection of our data is paramount. And privacy. Here we talk about making sure the use of personal data is appropriate and in context with our various codes of conduct, the laws that prevail across the jurisdictions that we operate in, and making sure we stay compliant with those at all time. Then you have data integrity. This is your traditional data management capability sitting within usually a CDO or a data sponsor organization, enabling those capabilities across the firm, harvesting the metadata that you need, making sure you have the right quality, you measure the right quality, etc. And I will be covering this a little bit in more detail later on in the session because I want to focus quite a bit of time on this topic. The rest of the topics are just as important. It's just I feel they have generally a little bit more airtime in other forums in this session. And then last but not least, your records management capability, retention, disposal of data, in line with not just your organizational needs, but also the various regulatory and other compliance needs across the firm. So that kind of gives you some context around how you look at data how we look at data at UBS. I mentioned the first bucket falls into your Chief Information Security Office. We have a data protection office that covers some of your privacy aspects. We have then a separate team that looks at your data management aspects from a governance standpoint, from a data quality standpoint. And then lastly, you have your records management custodians and their associated capabilities that deploy across the enterprise. Each of these capabilities come together in a manner to deliver the results that we need. Okay, so now let's go a little. I want to spend a few minutes on this slide. And we talked a little bit about data integrity earlier. And here, I want to talk through what we mean by the certain capabilities, how these capabilities come to life at UBS. And then I'll pause a few minutes for a few quick questions if there are any in the room, and then maybe we go back to the rest of the session, but I'll go through a few examples. Okay, so data governance. I think I put this up first simply because without this, I don't think the other capabilities would be as useful across the firm. They won't come together as easily as they need to, and I think that drives the rest of the firm's exercises. At UBS, we have a 3-tiered data governance structure, and this data governance structure starts at the exec level. So the top tier covers the key decision makers across the firm, whether it is an executive board, a C-suite, whatever you want to call it, but the highest form of decision or the highest decisions are made at this group. This includes setting the strategy for the firm, the entire enterprise, not just each business division. It includes setting the policies and the guidelines that need to be enforced across all of our jurisdictions and making sure that oversight is established at the highest level. Note, I did not say chief data officers, et cetera, because to me, this is where the business decision-making needs to take place, where the risk management needs to take place, and that then drives what happens in the second tier. The second tier of governance we have essentially is the collection of the data leaders across the enterprise, whether it's the chief data officer of a business division, whether it is the data sponsor of a respective group function, whether it is our capability leads across the various parts of the firm, so heads of data quality, et cetera. And this second tier structure establishes how the various policies that are set come to life across the entire firm. And then you have the third tier, which essentially is where the rubber hits the road. This is where all of those, the direction set by the data leaders following the policies that were set by the first tier of governance starts to enact those needs across the firm, where you have the various producers and consumers of data interacting with this layer on an ongoing basis. The second thing to mention in terms of governance is we have a federated operating model. So if you think about the various divisions and functions I talked about, having a federated operating model allows the differing needs of those organizations to come to light. Okay, now if you think about a business division or a group function, their needs, while aligned to the same organizational goals, can come from slightly different perspectives. I'll give you an example of, let's say, a simple derivatives trade, an over-the-counter derivatives trade, right? Now, you can have a trader within the IB booking that trade. So just say it's one trade for the entire year across the entire firm, okay? The information, the data from that one trade is required by our colleagues in group finance for their financial reporting, other colleagues in group finance for their regulatory reporting, other colleagues in group finance for their management reporting, and that's just within the group finance function. Then you think about your risks functions. You have your credit and market risk functions, your settlement risk functions, your operational risk functions, all of which need data on that one trade. Then you look at your operations organization. You have your settlements functions, your confirmations functions, your respective reconciliation, funding, and liquidity organization, who also need information from that trade. And that's not counting your compliance functions and all the rest that are there within the firm. So you can see, even though it is a single transaction across a single organization, how the data is used, how it needs to be consumed, how you manage that data is pretty significant. Okay. So that's why we have a federated operating model. But a federated operating model left to itself, a completely federated one, would create some other challenges. Consistency in terms of how data is consumed across the organization or even produced and owned. And this is where you need a central hub that basically brings together these capabilities, establishes the standards that are required across the entire firm, especially a firm that is rather large. Okay. Moving on to data documentation. Here, essentially, what I'm referring to is metadata management, right? And I put this next because without having that governance, without having the right set of policies, procedures, standards, and methods, your ability to execute and the capture and collation of metadata is going to be challenging, right? As we probably all know, managing and maintaining metadata over time is not cheap, right? And you need to be able to identify, okay, what data is key or critical to the organization, and that is part and parcel of what you do from a governance standpoint. Once you recognize what data is key or critical and which business processes, which reports, which models, et cetera, it's used in, you can then start to apply the various levels of care you have around that data and surfacing and maintaining the metadata that's required for that. So you got to incorporate your scoping exercises to identify key and critical, then develop the central capabilities and methods, and then clearly support them with tooling that allows you to deliver and maintain that metadata. Moving on to the next topic, data quality. This, I guess, is probably one of the most popular topics anyway. Everybody in the organization has an opinion about the quality of data, right? Whether it is the trader who books the trade, whether it is the settlement clerk who settles the trade, whether it is the finance function that reports on that trade, and quite in fact, they have multiple opinions on the same set of data, right? So I won't spend a lot of time talking through that, but I will make a few points that I think need to be reflected on. Quite often, when you're looking at it from an enterprise level, you've got to understand how you measure the quality of data. And I'll talk a little bit later on about our data quality assessments and how we look at this. I'm not talking about maturity assessments. I'm talking more specifically in the context of data and how we measure the quality of data across the enterprise, not just within a specific business division or function. You need to have a robust data quality issue management process, and this needs to be able to triage issues across the firm. If not, you'll have a tendency to find that a lot of your data issues are surfaced specifically in your consuming functions, because they generally tend to be the first to identify issues with your data. Okay, and then you need to be able to identify those issues and translate them over to the specific business division or function or owner of that data so that they can resolve and address those issues on a timely and accurate fashion. So if you take the example I brought up earlier, you can have, let's say, one issue with that derivative transaction can find itself across your finance function, your operations functions, your risk functions at different points of time in the life cycle of that trade. And that is where you want to be able to triage and bring all of these things together, because you don't want the same issue being solved 5 different times in the organization. Okay, last but not least, looking at data sourcing. Here, this is where I think you got to incorporate your longer-term strategic fixes to address some of the challenges that your organization faces. What do I mean by this? Firstly, understanding where to source data, how to source it easily, right, in a governed fashion is one of the bigger challenges we've tended to face over the last few years. Getting data access in a governed fashion is not easy in any given enterprise, and doing so across an organization the size of US is a continuing challenge. Now, this ties to the other 3 capabilities I talked about, because if your execution and management sourcing of data is not done efficiently, and the ability to source metadata associated with the data you use to execute governance over it is manual, the cost of those other 3 processes are going to be pretty significant. So this is where things like computational governance, et cetera, start to come into play. Key parts for us here are we have, for example, a certification process across the firm that looks at pretty much thousands of applications to identify what the appropriate sources are there. It is a pretty formal process because you don't want a proliferation of data sources across the firm for the same domain, right? You want the ability to make sure that those sources are, the authoritative sources have the right degree of quality and support multiple use cases across the organization. Then you want to be able to tie those governance and other policies to your software development lifecycle. And that, especially in organizations with large technology platforms, can be a bit of a challenge. So how do you tie what you want from a data governance, a data quality, data sourcing standpoint into the software that gets developed by the thousands of developers that you have in your firm? So some things to think about. All right? So I'll cover this and then maybe pause for a few questions. So let's talk about how we bring this to life inside of UBS. All of the things I just talked about. So at our firm, we have, like I said, a set of policies and frameworks. Those policies and frameworks essentially are encapsulated in an enterprise-wide data management framework. And I repeat the word enterprise-wide because you need that consistent framework to be applied across the various business divisions, whether it's the IB, whether it's your asset management, whether it's your wealth management franchise, as well as the respective group functions like your finance, risk, operations, and other teams. So having that in place across that enables a certain degree of consistency in how each of these spaces approach it. So you start with basically the what, right? The articulation of the strategy in the form of specific objectives and guidelines that are then cascaded across the firm. Then this is tied to who does the work. Now, like I mentioned earlier, there is a variety of roles, et cetera, associated with data management. Okay, you need to have a clear set of roles and responsibilities described. These roles and responsibilities need to be integrated very closely with your performance management process. Because you can give somebody a role, but if it's not tied to how they are incentivized, how their performance is measured, you will run into challenges in execution. Usually in these organizations, some of the data management responsibilities tend to be a side-of-the-desk job, right? And incorporating that into the specific objectives of the organization, I think makes a pretty significant difference. Supporting these roles and responsibilities has to be the training. And we talked, I think earlier there was a question around data literacy at the keynote session. And you need to think about how the entire organization is trained on data. Then you've got to think about your specific role holders across the organization. Make sure they have the appropriate training to execute on what they need to do. And then bring it all together with your second and third lines of defense. So this is where you get the degree of challenge coming from whether it's your second line functions, your audit functions, et cetera. So at UBS, we train roughly 30,000 people every year. We have, and that's on the broader training that we have. We train 1,000 to 2,000 people who are specific role holders so that they understand their responsibilities as consumers or producers of data. We train a few hundred people who are auditors and challenge functions like your compliance functions to make sure they are aware of how they need to challenge the respective business divisions and functions in the execution of the framework. These three things come together in an interaction model, which is also baked into the framework. Then, once you have the right policies and procedures in place, then you have the right capabilities and training and roles and responsibilities there. You now also need to think about how some of these things are done. Because you could have data lineage in all the divisions, you can require lineage, et cetera, in all the divisions, but if it's not done the same way, not done in a consistent fashion, not captured in a standard set of tools, aggregating that information, stitching it all together can be a pretty significant challenge. So we have articulated a set of standards and methods. For example, I use lineage. You have a set of lineage methodologies that have been published across the firm, and supporting that are the right sets of tools to make sure that the the delivery and capture of this information is available across the firm. A standard data quality issue management system that everybody logs their issues in the same space, right? So you capture the same set of metadata, you follow a similar issue management process. That issue management process aligns with your governance, which then makes sure that your issues are being resolved on a timely and accurate fashion, and then supports, for example, your colleagues in your second and third lines of defense to make sure they're looked at from that perspective as well. So I covered the what, the who, and the how, and I talked a little bit about the tooling. But I do want to spend a few minutes and say the data management framework doesn't stand alone in an island, right? You have to think about how these frameworks align with the rest of the frameworks that you have within your organization. In financial services firms, you have your non-financial risk frameworks, your risk frameworks, your model governance. All of those things need to align, because if not, you'll find that the data management aspects tend to be put to a separate side and seen as, again, a side of the desk job, right? When these risks, et cetera, are aligned to your non-financial risk frameworks and your other frameworks, you can see they have kind of a positive correlation in terms of resolving and addressing issues. And that connection, I think, is important. I even mentioned earlier how those roles and responsibilities tie into your performance management process. So all of these things help reinforce each other as you execute data governance across the firm. Now, all of this that I just talked about come together in the context of transformation. So if you think about the first few points I made, whether you're looking at data for decision-making purposes, whether it's in a risk committee, a management committee, a audit committee, all of these areas, they leverage the data. The data relies on the framework. The framework ensures that it's appropriately produced and consumed across the organization. You think about driving process improvements, okay, or understanding where you have bottlenecks. Let's say you have an operational risk issue that resulted in trades not getting settled on time. Okay, what does that mean from a data management framework perspective? Did you raise the appropriate data quality issues? Did that surface where there was a limitation in your operational process? Has that limitation then been addressed? Clearly, when you're aggregating systems, when you're consolidating applications, when moving from on-prem to cloud, you start to see questions around data quality and all coming to the fore, again, leveraging similar activities, as I said before. So with that, I'm going to pause for a few minutes to see if there are any questions in the room or online. And if not, I can go then straight on to the some of the examples of how these things are executed. Yes, there's a question in the room. I think you need the mic. Yes.
I'm in the data quality space, Ellen Gentili. I'm with Edward Jones, and I was wondering about the issue management part of this, right? So I know the metadata and the data catalog, is a big part of where the policies and everyone at the organization understands the data. But when you have a data quality issue, are you buy versus build? And if you do, did you do a lot of customization to bring in the metadata and then the workflows to get it to the different roles, like informing the data stewards, but the data custodians are assigned, that type of complexity? Because when you're talking about trades, resolving SLAs and things like that, and understanding what risks these issues, could you go through some of that quick? I asked a lot. I know.
No, I get the point around on data quality, right? Yeah. So I'll start pretty much. I'll follow the same guideline. So let's start at the top, right? So in principle, we believe data risk is a form of non-financial risk, right? So clearly, any data risk you surface has to align with your non-financial risk policies, has to be aligned with how you measure and manage non-financial risk. So you start there by making sure that your policies are aligned, not just within your data management framework, but also with your non-financial risk framework. So when you report on it and you report your risk, you're covering it on both sides. Then if you think about what we consider to be an issue, because quite often you get a debate of incidents versus issues. So we try to distinguish clearly in terms of defining what is an issue, which is essentially something that's more persistent, versus something that is a one-off or a one-off incident. okay? And again, here we leverage, if you take in terms of how you rank and rate these issues, we leverage frameworks that already exist within the firm, right? So rather than inventing a rubric that you use to do that. Then once you've identified, okay, all of those aspects, then you got to figure out, okay, how do you now align the tooling to capture these things? Here, we started out with build, okay, and I think generally speaking, because the metadata we capture, for example, on a non-financial risk issue needs to align with the metadata we capture on a data quality issue, right? Because if they didn't, then we can't keep the alignment of our frameworks easily. The other challenge I think we had is you got to distinguish when you say data quality issues, depending on it's kind of eye of the beholder type problem, right? Because any particular issue can be called a data quality issue. So you need to have a robust way in which you can surface which issues are data quality issues versus, let's say, process improvements or other means. Then if you think about how you resolve the issues, you also need to then encourage resolution of the issue at source, right? Because you don't want people doing a whole bunch of adjustments, trying to fix data in one place. So if I use my example before, you don't want your financial reporting folks adjusting for data quality issues that they surface, whereas your reg reporting folks and your management reporting folks not being aware of those adjustments and not being able to incorporate those things. So you've got to then tie that bit into your governance around how you resolve issues. Hopefully that helps. Right? Cool.
Hi, I'm May. I'm a Chief Data Officer at Gulf Bank of Kuwait. So we have the data stewards, we've done the data quality, we have a process for data quality with the business data stewards owning that. We've done the data literacy. We're at the phase now where kind of going into lineage and heavy governance. And you mentioned, I have two questions. The first one is, to start with data lineage, where to start? Do I start with my systems and go then ask the users, or should I start with the business processes and then go track the systems? So where to start, tech or business process? The other one, you mentioned the certification process. Can you elaborate on that? Like, how often do you do it? What systems are covered and so on? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so let's start with the first one, right? So you call it heavy governance, I think was the term you used, right? I think there's a couple of things to think about before you advance your kind of lineage agenda, right? There's a tendency, especially in organizations, to think about lineage as a panacea to all things data, right? I don't necessarily always agree. I think lineage, like everything else, is a tool. And as a tool, it helps solve a specific problem, understanding, for example, where your data comes from, is it the right place, do you have the right controls, that kind of thing. So I think when you apply the need for lineage, you got to align it with a specific business need. Okay. Now, clearly, if you have, let's say, some key reg reports, etc., that require the highest levels of assurance, right, it may be important for you to apply lineage purely as a means of gathering some increased assurance that you're getting the data from the right place. So that's the first thing. Second is, I would say, you got to look at it from the context of the consumer, because beauty truly does lie in the eye of the beholder when it comes to data. Right? An issue with a reg report or a financial report that consolidates and aggregates data for, to the tune of several $1 billion, right, is very different to understand the quality of data in your payments process, where $25 may make a difference, right? Okay, so you've got to be able to contextualize where and how you're applying it. The third bit I would say is capturing of lineage. Whether you are following a central versus a decentralized process. Okay, and this is where that standard and method comes in. So the principle we take is we have a central capability that captures lineage, but we also allow the business division to capture lineage if they want, using their own funding, etc., but it has to follow the standard method. Okay, so which then allows the stitching of that information there. And then lastly, there are some advantages that you have now that, for example, we didn't have 6 or 7 years ago when we started some of these exercises, right? You have tooling that allows data that's moved on the cloud, that allows you to harvest metadata at far less marginal cost than we did, even 5 years ago. So I would look to leverage some of those things. One other thing to add probably to that would be, as you think of your migration to cloud, a lot of this tooling happens on the cloud, so is more easily deployed in the cloud, so you should be thinking about those aspects. Yeah? So that covers hopefully the first question, right? From the second about certification. So as you go through a lineage, you need to understand, okay, well, especially the larger your suite of applications, your infrastructure stack, you got to think about, okay, well, how do you know where the right place to get data is, right? Especially in relation to your software development lifecycle. Because usually people tend to get data from the path of least resistance, and that may not always be the best place to get data, right? And this essentially results in kind of your daisy chain that you get in large enterprises. Here, and this is where you've got to embed your SDLC with your certification of the appropriate sources, and I'll cover that actually a little bit later on in the session. Maybe one more question before we continue?
Hi. Applying this kind of data management framework across such a large firm and in a federated way has a lot of challenges. One of them being resistance to adopt the policies and the guidelines designed at the central hub to be applied on the different companies or business units. And we're finding that resistance sometimes on the business areas, but it's something that I find easier to overcome than when we find that kind of resistance from IT teams that are somehow challenging the architecture or why they should be doing things and the way we're proposing instead of keeping doing the things that they've been doing for so long that we know are not working. But this is a time-consuming and an effort-consuming conversation. How have you overcome these challenges? And I guess probably you're not facing them now because once you're more mature on applying the framework, these conversations just fade in time. But when you started applying this framework, I guess you faced some challenges similar to this. How did you tackle them?
Thank you. So I think a few things, right? So firstly, getting any change in a relatively large org is going to be challenging, right? The default response sometimes tends to be no. Okay, or why should I do this? Or what's the value of it? What are you going to tell me I don't already know, right? You take the point around lineage, right? Quite often, you rely on subject matter experts who already know how they get data to have them describe how they get that data, right? So they go, okay, you're just taking what I'm saying, writing it down, and playing it right back to me, right? Okay, so that generally does tend to be a challenge. However, and there is a certain critical mass that you have to be able to get past in order to achieve a certain degree of value extraction that comes from the metadata assets that you create as a result, right? Because your first report is going to be, okay, fine, I already know how that comes, right? But your nth report suddenly starts to, use the same lineage flows, provide a view of how all of this reporting comes together, etc. So going back again, I use the same set. This is where you need the sponsorship from the senior organization, right? If, from a senior management perspective, you do not have that sponsorship, overriding some of these challenges is going to be difficult, right? That's one thing, but that I think probably most people already know. The second thing we did was, when you look at data quality issues, because ultimately, this is about data quality, right? It's the quality of your reports, the quality of your data used in your business processes, quality of the data used in your decision making. And you've got to be able to incentivize the use of that. And what we found was, if you take the most significant issues, funding is generally not a problem for them, right? Because people recognize they're significant issues. They generally tend to address that funding, and usually the business division or function that is impacted by that issue the most tends to provide the funding to remediate, because funding generally follows attention within an organization, right? What we did was we said, okay, we're going to set aside a pot of money, And we're going to use this money to address a population of issues that are cross-divisional or cross-functional in nature, right? And that are not covered by the top priority. So essentially, you create a pool of, a honeypot for lack of a better word, right? That basically allows you to address some of the issues that may not always get the attention that the most significant issues do. So when folks start to see, hey, listen, not only does this have senior management buy-in, not only does this help me solve some of the issues that I haven't been able to solve in my organization for a while, you start to see some of that resistance drop, okay? That said, you still need to get past some of these hurdles, and this is where now in tooling, like I just talked about earlier, starts to make it a little bit easier. The cost of compliance needs to come down, and I think by going on to, let's say, cloud platforms, et cetera, some of that cost of compliance does tend to come down. And then lastly, I'd say the integration with the other parts of the framework, other frameworks within the firm help you. And this is where, so if you see something discussed at your respective non-financial risk committee, in addition to your data committee, now you start to say, hey, listen, I get this is a problem, we need to start solving, if you see what I mean. Okay, I would actually add one more thing in there, is your second and third line, your lines of defense, right? They make sure that once you publish the framework and the policy, adherence to the policy becomes part and parcel of how you execute across the organization. Does that make sense? Cool. I'll spend a few more minutes on a couple of examples, and hopefully that will help contextualize what I'm saying, and then we go back to a few more questions. Right? So I talked a little bit about the framework. I talked a little bit about how we have the right tooling. So all of these aspects we try to bring together into kind of a common portal that is leveraged across the firm. Okay? You can imagine trying to get a banker, a trader, and a financial advisor to agree on the definition of a client, which I assure you can take quite a big deal of time, right? Some of these aspects, I think, need to be made available across the enterprise. I think we spend a lot of time and money capturing and aligning metadata and the tools associated with it, but we need it to make it easier for them to access. For the 20,000, 30,000 plus people that use this data on a regular basis, they need to be able to get at these definitions, get at these sources, understand how the information connects to each other make it easy to access, right? You can imagine drawing a map and then suddenly putting that map in a locker, hiding it 6,000 miles under the sea or something like that, and then getting at the data is going to be really difficult. That really doesn't help, right? The more these metadata assets are used, the more value we extract out of them, and the easier they're able to get at, the better the more they will be used. So I think about this from the perspective of my finance background. If you think of data as an asset, it is how often do you utilize it? How long do you turn over the asset, right? And that's what you've got to think about. Next, I talked about data quality. Here, quite often the question I get asked is, well, how do you measure the quality of data across the enterprise? Okay, and one of the answers that's often given is by the number of data quality issues. Okay, and to me, I think that is a partial answer, right? Simply because, the surfacing of data quality issues, right? The management of those aren't always consistent on various parts of the enterprise. So you've got to think about how you bring together the measurement of data quality across the firm. And what we did at UBS a few years back is we implemented a annual data quality assessment from a consumer standpoint. And we use a standard methodology for this assessment across the entire firm. This way, you have the ability to aggregate all of that assessment information, look at it on a domain-by-domain basis, and then determine whether you're seeing proactive improvement in the quality of data in that specific domain. It also helps you surface specific themes across the organization, which then drive where you invest in remediation and so forth. It also then takes the data quality information you have, you align that information by domain, and you start to see where remediation of your data quality issues starts to bring together improvement and value to the firm. Okay, and then you can measure this over time. Okay, it is a bit of an exercise because you need to identify what, for example, your key data outputs are. because not all data is created equal, not all data can go through an assessment. You've got to be able to then incorporate that assessment information, do it consistently for a few years before you really start to extract value, right? But one of the things I think worth mentioning is you got to look at also, let's say from a consumer standpoint, you got to be able to figure out how to really surface their data quality issues, because quite often you have data inputs that then get adjusted, fixed 6 days from Sunday before they get published out the door, right? And quite a few folks take pride in the fact that they fix the data and put it out the door, right? So you've got to be able to think about, okay, how you assess data quality. And what we do is we look at it from 2 perspectives. So each output for a given domain gets 2 ratings: the quality of data as it comes in and the quality of data as it's used in the report. So that way, you then go, okay, hey, listen, thank you for doing a good job in fixing the issue, right? But we now know that you have an issue of data coming in. We've got to figure out whether that's common across the organization, and we use that information to drive remediation, implementation of controls, and so forth. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on monitoring. I think there's a whole bunch of conversations that can take place around monitoring. I do want to mention something we learned over the last few years on this, right? One of the biggest challenges we have with implementing monitoring across the firm is generally it calls on one of the most precious resources we have, which is our subject matter experts. And writing good rules can take up a lot of time, maintaining those rules, understanding the quality of the exceptions, the number of false positives, that's great. So I would say, use cautiously, but there are obviously there's new tech coming out that allows you to write more sophisticated rules with better results. Then lastly, before we go back into kind of questions again, what I do want to talk a bit about is how we tie all of that work I talked about earlier to your SDLC, okay? And here, when you have a technologist developing code and they try to get at data and they try to get data from the easiest, how do you enforce sourcing data from the right place as part of that? And what we did was we basically used the natural incentive systems you have within the firm, the funding that you put aside, and specific toll gates that you have along the way. So we have a standard asset inventory for all of our applications, right? And built into that asset inventory, we've integrated certain rules. So for example, if you are looking to shall we say, buy a new app, right? One of the first questions that gets asked as part of the funding for that purchase is how does that application use data, or where is it sourced from? Don't get it from a master source, immediately decline. No funding. You're about to release code into the environment, okay? Is it getting data from the right place? No, decline, right? And then you manage that as an exception. So pretty soon you start to see the organization change its tune around where it's getting its data, how it's sourcing from. Now, there's other things you can do to make getting data from the right place easier. This is virtualization, this is marketplaces, data products, and you've heard all this talked about. But organizationally, you got to get the firm thinking in the right fashion before you're able to execute on some of these things, right? And that is ultimately aligning it with the right incentive systems, the right culture, so that the behavior gets amplified. Yeah. Now, somebody was asking a question earlier around how easy it is to make changes. This was probably one of the hardest things we had to do. You can imagine the number of irate calls I get the night before a code's about to go live saying, Lafir, your rules are preventing us from going live and it's impacting X number of projects, right? But again, with the right management support, you're able to then make sure, hey, listen, why are you getting data from the wrong place? How do you know you're getting the right data? How do you know you're aligned to the right standard taxonomies? All of those questions start to get asked and get the right level of attention. Yes, you make a few exceptions along the way, but you make those exceptions rather painful, right? And that then drives behavior across the firm. All right, I think I've spent quite a bit of time now talking through essentially how data management capabilities are foundational towards driving change. We talked about how we bring the policies, the frameworks, et cetera, together, how they drive decision-making, innovation, and optimization across the organization. Talked through a few examples of how they came to life. So probably over to you for questions.
10 minutes left. No questions from online.
Hey, so this is Prasanna from ThoughtWorks, I guess. Quick two questions. One is, did you have to deal with multi-jurisdiction data residency and kind of the access control, summary reporting, and like the craziness that ensues there? And the second part is, how did you tie the metrics from a data perspective to the business metrics? And because it's probably easier for somebody to say, if this application doesn't go live, then we lose so much in revenue, and you're preventing that revenue from coming in because of these checks, than it is for you to say that, well, I'm safeguarding this much by doing this. So how do you justify in terms of dollars?
So couple of points. So let's answer the first question. Short answer is yes, we've had to deal with jurisdictional issues in that context, right? And the way we approach, and this is where I think the specialization we have in those various roles comes to the fore, right? So we have, for example, a data protection office, right, that makes sure that we are, complying with the right laws and regulations, as well as our own principles around how we approach data. Data sharing and so forth. And I want to spend a minute on that, because generally when you talk about the role of a CDO, you got to think about, okay, what skill sets do you need in that role? And you can see, depending on these 3 or 4 types of things that we do from a data management standpoint, you need very, very different skill sets. One, for let's say your CISO type stuff, you need a strong technologist. Probably your privacy, you need somebody who understands the law, right? From your integrity standpoint, you understand people who understand data as it's used in the organization, and so on and so forth. So I think, having that specialization across the firm, and those specializations working closely together using kind of that central governance of hubs, etc., I think is very useful, right? Second point around metrics. Not easily is the answer, right? But if I give you a little bit more of color there, I would say a few things. So firstly, by, let's say, putting to place something like our data quality assessment, you start to measure how a division of functions data quality looks over time, right? And the best thing for human behavior is, people don't like being second. They don't like being last, right? And you can compare data across the organization. It becomes a little bit of a competition on how you can improve your data, right? Okay, how you surface those issues and address. So you tie the work that you do from a data management standpoint to specific business outcomes that help. And you see this through improvements in the quality of your reg reporting, quality of your financial reporting, efficiencies in your operational process. And now with the advent of AI, you start to see, okay, how that helps train AI in the right way, use AI for optimization of business processes and so forth. Hopefully that covers it. Cool.
Hi, I'm Paula from Farmacias Peruanas from Peru. I was curious about the organizational design you had to put in place to assure quality when software was developed, one of your last slides. Did you put data team in the development squads, or is it another separate team that does the QA or final check? How did you make it happen?
Thank you. That's a great question, right? The answer is it changes over time, right? So if you think at the outset, when we started establishing some of these capabilities, they facilitated more of some of the, let's say BCBS 239 requirements from a reg standpoint, or specific regulatory outcomes in the risk and finance space. Then you started to see an evolution of those capabilities extend across the rest of the organization. So whether it's your operations function, your IB, your wealth management business divisions, etc. Then you start to see, okay, once people had a good idea of data governance, etc., do you then start to align that with more your colleagues in technology? So the Group Data Management Office, the organization I run, essentially has aligned at different points in time with your COO organization and within your technology organization. Okay, so it does tend to vary over time. But from a wider construct perspective, I go back to the point I was making earlier. We start by establishing that governance structure. So this includes essentially setting at the highest levels of the organization with representation from every business division function, a committee which governs the entire firm's data management strategy. Then we've established a central capability within the Group Data Management Office, which supports the entire organization in the execution of that strategy. Within each organization, you have essentially the respective chief data officers, data sponsors, et cetera, that can help drive the strategy within that. So you have a combination of folks that bring all of this together. And then you have established capability within the rest of the firm. So your first, second, and third line, which has ownership of challenge and other functions. So organizationally, you have a federated structure. That federated structure allows the business divisions to operate within a defined operating model. And then we define the interactions between the two. So for example, we would articulate how the producers and the consumers interact, how the first line and the second line interact in the context of all of the capabilities, whether it's data quality, data governance, lineage, and other aspects, if that helps.
We have a question from online. Do you use globally one data catalog or multiple? If multiple, how do you ensure common definitions, et cetera, especially if you have a federated approach?
So I think as of end of last month, we have a single catalog, right? Because what happened, I think, was some parts of the firm were faster to adopt data management capability than others. So they tend to build their own capabilities and own tooling. We've now consolidated that into one. So I think that has been very helpful. Now, the second question, I think, is a bigger challenge, because the more you try to centralize, especially in an organization that has very strong business divisions and group functions, you get a certain degree of pushback, because you essentially get kind of a reversion to the mean, so to speak. So what you've got to be able to do is allow a certain degree of flexibility for the organization to execute their data management needs. And you see a natural kind of affinity to certain types of capabilities. So you take, for example, your finance or your risk functions, they generally tend to be large data consumers, right? You take, let's say, your IBs and your wealth management, they tend to be generally the producers of data. Not that they don't consume data, and not that the functions don't produce either, but you generally tend to see a certain affinity. And so they tend to mature those capabilities faster, and you need to allow that in your org design, actually. Because if you don't allow for that flexibility, what you start to see is people see this as not generally relevant to their day-to-day job, and you want to kind of avoid that. One other thing I'd mention is how you structure your metadata also is important, because the way we look at our data governance tools is we have kind of a central data definition, but we allow certain nuances to take place within the respective business divisions and functions. Right? Now, some of them take advantage of that where they have a particular view, some don't. Some rely purely on the central capability. So I would say at a minimum, you have that covered, the essential parts covered through your central capability, and then where a business division wants to expand or commercialize or do other things, they have that flexibility to do so as well.
Another question online. I do understand you talked about managing data quality for critical data elements. How do you manage, govern, and monitor data quality for non-critical elements?
I think that's a great question, right? So the way I look at it is, and this also goes back to how we establish the policy, right? The principle we take is data quality is important. It is important for the execution of day-to-day business, regardless of whether it's key or non-key. However, the levels of care that you apply vary. So it's like any asset that you would manage, right? So let's take real estate, right? You can have a building in Manhattan, or you can have a small branch in Stamford, Connecticut, right? Either way, they're still buildings. You still safeguard the asset, but the degree and care that you implement varies based on the criticality of that asset. So I would say we believe data quality is important across all assets. Some assets are more important than others.
Thank you.
Cool.
No other questions online? Any more in the room?
There's one more back there.
Got a couple minutes left.
Hello, my name is Vanessa Jones-Neoni from Commerzbank. Just a follow-up question on the critical versus non-critical. At UBS, how do you define critical data, and what are the specific criteria used to use to define critical data?
So I could spend probably an hour on that topic alone, but a couple of interesting things, right? So, you can talk about critical data from the perspective of the producer and the consumer, right? But I'll focus on the consumer generally in this context, right? First, and I take the view that from a central function perspective, we provide the expectations that each business division or function has to follow. Okay, when they surface what data is key or critical, and so forth. And the way we do this to differing extents. There are certain types of data outputs that almost always tend to be critical, and generally these tend to rely on where there's key regulatory interactions, etc. Then there's other types of data that can be critical, cannot always be critical. Like, so for example, where you have critical business processes and so forth. So the degree of flexibility that we allow a business division or function to choose its key or critical data varies with the type of output that you're talking about. So, and this goes back to the point I was making earlier, you have to give some degree of flexibility across the firm to allow for that. So this way you make sure as an enterprise, you have a certain minimum standard. You have then a measure by which each division can add more into that equation. You then also provide the right degree of oversight to have exceptions, because every rule can sometimes have an exception, and that exception process is tightly governed, and that's ties to our governance process. And then lastly, I would say leverage your existing guidance or other existing frameworks to the extent you can. So if you think for your non-financial risk framework or your financial risk frameworks, they generally, or your business continuity management, they tend to surface areas that are key or critical as a means of what they do, right? And if you tie those in, to my point on aligning with other frameworks, you then get to a situation where you can leverage those to your advantage. Cool? Probably maybe our last question. Are we done?
I think we're done.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Lafir, for all your insights. I believe we now have lunch break until 1 o'clock. We can't be here without the support of the sponsors, so please go and spend some time with them in the lunch hall. Thank you.